I'm Sienna. I'm the kid.
I'm Sarah. I'm the mom.
This is Queer Kid Straight Mom.
Let's talk.
Welcome back to Queer Kids Straight Mom. Sorry, we had a little bit of a delay getting this episode out. We ended up not being able to record one of the episodes we were hoping to do. And so we had to rearrange a few things. But we think this is a really important thing to talk about right now, too, because it is Pride Month. We wanted to discuss a brief history of Pride, why it exists, why it's a thing, and kind of the roots of the gay rights movement, because there's a lot more there than just a big party, even though the big party part of it is fun and cool.
Very convenient for corporations.
And very convenient for corporations, which we've talked about, the rainbow washing and all of that, which you can really see this year with a lot of the companies that have backed out of sponsoring Pride events now that it is a little bit more controversial, sadly. Sienna, why don't you give us a brief history of how this all started?
Okay, so fun fact, the history of Stonewall, which is often sort of credited as the beginning of the gay rights movement, is really contentious. So if we're speaking broadly, the gay rights movement really probably began late 1800s with some of the first gay rights groups that existed. And then you had some more going into the 1900s, like the Mattachine Society. So you had these groups that already existed, but in 1969, you had the famous Stonewall riots, uprising, revolution, whatever you want to call it. And then out of that, 1 year later, for the anniversary of Stonewall, were the first kind of Pride marches as we would sort of understand them today, although, again, they have changed pretty significantly. It was much more of a protest into something much more like a party. But you might have seen things around saying, this year is a great reminder that Pride is a protest, not a party. And yeah, that's very much true. So the first Pride marches were organized on the 1 year anniversary of Stonewall. And if you're not familiar with what Stonewall was, the Stonewall Inn was a gay bar in New York City. The details of Stonewall itself, like the Stonewall uprising, is where it gets really sort of ambiguous and contentious because we really don't know that much. Queer history was not a thing back then. So really people only started making academic records of it later. In broad strokes, kind of what we can say for sure is that the Stonewall Inn was run by the mafia because a lot of gay bars were run by the mafia because, it was illegal. It did not have a liquor license. And so the police liked to use those things as a pretext for raiding bars and then arresting people based on New York's sort of morality codes. One of the things that those specified was that people had to be wearing at least 3 articles of gender-appropriate clothing.
Wow.
Yeah. So if your birth certificate or your driver's license said that you were a man and you were wearing a dress, you could be arrested for that. So people would get arrested. And this was happening more and more frequently. The Stonewall Inn would get raided once a month at least. And I think I've seen a couple of accounts that have said it had already been raided once that week. So people were getting really fed up. And so the police raided it on this particular night. And for whatever reason, whatever it was that was the breaking point, and that is where there are some differing accounts that come in. One thing that people weirdly like to say is that it's because Marsha P. Johnson was sad that Judy Garland had died.
Tell me more.
I mean, that's about it, is that for whatever reason, something that has been kind of incorporated into the myth.
Wait, and who is that?
Oh, so Marsha P. Johnson is a fairly famous Black, probably transgender woman. She referred to herself as a drag queen and transvestite, but she was speaking before the term transgender was really popularized. And she became a pretty significant activist, gay and trans rights movement leader in the years after Stonewall. However, this is why I say it's contentious, right? According to her account, she didn't actually even get to Stonewall until 2 a.m, when the protests had already broken out.
So she is saying, no, I did not start this because I was sad about Judy Garland.
I don't even know if she's directly. I think she has said, yes, I was sad about Judy Garland. I don't know that she's ever addressed that in the context of Stonewall anyway. And so, yeah, then these protests broke out. Another person who is sometimes credited with starting the protest is Storm Delarvier, who was, again, this is another point of contention. I've seen both things said. I've heard it said that they were a non-binary or transgender man, and I've also heard it said that they were a butch lesbian. Again, we just don't have that much information, especially because this was before a lot of the terms that we use to describe identities had really been popularized.
Okay.
They were getting arrested and they started shouting at people like, why aren't you doing anything? Like, why are you letting this happen? And then people, started throwing stuff at the cops. And then after that, those protests went on for, I think, 5 nights of just people protesting outside the stone wall. And like I said, then these groups like the Gay Liberation Front were formed and started organizing pride protests on the 1-year anniversary of Stonewall. Although other groups had existed in the past, there was a much more kind of radical movement that grew out of Stonewall.
So like the very next year, there was sort of a commemoration of that. And then that just kind of grew into Pride.
As far as I've seen, yeah.
Okay. So did anything change legally? I mean, obviously things have changed legally, but is there an indication that that reaction that sort of we're tired of being treated like this made an impact? Did it draw people's attention to what was happening?
I think it took about 10 years for same-sex relations to be decriminalized, but I do think that there were pushes for non-discrimination laws, and I think definitely became more publicly visible. Like I said, that was sort of the beginning, and I think groups like the Human Rights Campaign, Gays and Lesbians Alliance Against Defamation, and Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, I think those groups all grew out of, if not Stonewall directly, then the movements that came out of Stonewall.
When do you happen to know when that law about it being illegal to dress, or like that you had to dress in gender appropriate clothing, changed?
According to PBS, a person perceived as male who dressed in clothing customarily designed for women could technically be arrested in New York for impersonating a female as recently as 2011, the remnants of a 19th century statewide law prohibiting wearing the dress of the opposite sex.
Looking at that, like it feels that we often run into this particular issue with a lot of these topics, that it's a lot more palatable for the general public, quote unquote, to think of Pride as like, oh, this is just a celebration, which it also is, but it's just a celebration of, we are who we are and we think it's important that we're allowed to be this way. But people get pretty uncomfortable with, throwing things at cops. That whole scene, and obviously that's not a recommended way of handling things.
But sometimes it's the only way of handling things.
And while these police officers were doing their job, I would venture to guess that they were not particularly kind and personable in their treatment of people when they were raiding gay clubs.
I mean, no, they weren't.
So, yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those situations of tempers really growing for a long time. And, it feels a little like what we're seeing in LA right now. People don't want to live in fear. In a healthy democracy, there's only so long you can make people live in fear before there has to be some kind of uprising.
Yeah, I mean, I've said this, that we have the right to protest for a reason. And I've always thought that the idea of, but you have to have a permit and you have to do it in the right way and you have to be palatable about it is really a way of kind of defanging that fundamental right that is a way of keeping the government in check. I kind of look at it as self-defense, right? If someone starts harassing you on the street, if you have the ability to punch them in the nose and run, you're going to do that, right? And that is something that's legally protected and that you have the right to use violence in self-defense. And so the right to protest is kind of like the right to self-defense on a broader scale, that we have the right to defend ourselves from overreach by the government, abusive policies, being unjustly arrested, being harassed by law enforcement. And if people feel that they have no alternative but to fight back, they're going to do that, and they are absolutely entitled to do that under the First Amendment.
Which is really kind of funny because a lot of the people that are supporting the Trump administration side of this immigration situation in LA, the Venn diagram of those people and the people who believed in a well-armed militia to fight back against government tyranny, there's a pretty big crossover there.
Right. I mean, I bet that they would respond a lot differently to, someone having an NRA bumper sticker versus someone being a member of Armed Queers of Salt Lake, for instance.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting that, right, if a Democrat were president and put in a sweeping gun control law, or not even put in, but like, we are really going to enforce this, and people
We're
were
going to hunt people down on the streets for minor gun safety violations
Mhm.
and deport them to El Salvador.
Right. Like, the gun people would not be sitting at home saying, well, I don't know, should we make some signs?
Something that's also worth pointing out is I know a lot of people are uncomfortable with the protests that happened today. Everyone's always uncomfortable with the protests when they happen, right? People were uncomfortable with women, like suffragettes protesting. They were uncomfortable with the civil rights protests. They would have called Stonewall disorderly and violent and unacceptable. They're always going to say that. And it's really a matter of, is the cause something that's important enough that it warrants putting pressure on the government?
Right. Yeah. So that's the beginnings of Pride. And as LGBTQ plus people are seeing their rights feeling threatened, what feels like a lot of backsliding.
Side note that I just recently saw a Pew Research survey that said that support for gay marriage has actually declined among Republicans for the first time in like 10 years or something, which, while not necessarily surprising, is very disturbing.
Yeah. Like, as a group, you got to a place where this was okay. And now
you remember just how much you hate gay people.
So yeah, this environment is concerning, to put it mildly. And so I think it's just really interesting to look at Pride and to understand that this came from a lot of oppression, that this desire to celebrate, people that like, why do we have to have Pride Month? Why do these people have to throw this in our faces and make a big deal out of their lifestyle? And especially the people that say, I don't care, just don't make a big deal out of it. Usually, like, it seems really do care. But the reason it's important, the reason it's a big deal, the reason that LGBTQ plus people get excited about Pride Month is it's like in a world that was so hard to find a place to be safe in for so long, getting to a point of being able to be in a parade to celebrate instead of having to hide, because people literally had to hide. Your life would be in danger if people found out you were gay back in those days, pre-Stonewall. And I think it's really difficult, without thinking about it in that context, to understand what a big deal that is, to be public about something that had to be such a secret for so long. Like, that in itself is just incredibly powerful, to be able to have a public display of, this is who I am. And I can not only admit that now, but I can actually be proud of it. So it's not just a, look at us, we are living in a way you don't approve of and you can't stop us. And oh, by the way, we have better clothes and better music and better dance moves. And, we're not just flaunting that to make you feel bad about yourselves. We are embracing something that you told us we should be ashamed of and refusing to be ashamed. And that is why there's Pride. That's why there's Pride Month. That's why there are parades. That's why this exists. So hopefully that was informative. A lot of you maybe know a lot of that, probably understand why Pride is important, but maybe don't know the history. I hope it's helpful to have that context. So when you're around somebody that says, why does this have to be a thing? We don't have Straight People Month, that you can kind of have some language to explain. It's about not having to hide anymore.
And if you're interested in learning more about some of the more contentious details of the Stonewall protests, New York Times did a very interesting little video interview essay type thing for Pride Month 6 years ago, maybe, about, I think it's titled, Who Threw the First Brick at Stonewall? And it gets into some of the details of like, were people throwing bricks at all, actually? Who were they?
There's probably some really interesting reading out there on this. And we actually are really interested to hear if anybody wants to message us and just kind of tell us about your experience with Pride this year and if it feels different to you and what is different. We'd be kind of interested in collecting some of that information from different places. Please do share if you feel like it. Hopefully, on that note, everybody is having a good Pride Month and enjoying summertime, school's getting out, and weather is getting better. And that's also a reason to celebrate in my world. Thanks for bearing with us, being patient as we scrambled a little bit there. And we'll catch you next time.
Bye.
If you found this episode interesting, informative, amusing, please review and follow us on your podcasting platform of choice. Getting those reviews and follows really helps us show up more in the algorithm and be able to reach more people to help them. You can find us on social media, Instagram and Threads at queerkid.straightmom, Blue Sky at qksm.bsky.social, and Facebook at queerkidstraightmom. We are no longer on Twitter.
And if you're feeling especially generous, please consider joining our Patreon by searching Queer Kids Straight Mom. It helps us fund this podcast.